All right, back with Eric. Boy, it's been 6 years since we shot him. Oh no, with Ron and Marlies here. Well, it was about 6 or 7 months ago, but 6 years, our first video on this porch. We're back at it. Eric, you've been working hard all day, but you're calling it a day,
It's just about time to call it a day. The sun's just about to hit that horizon, another 10 minutes or something.
Well, let's dig into this. I got some commentary to add, and you're going to get into Bereshit there. When does the day begin? Let's go through Scripture and just cast the tradition
minutes.
aside.
Of course, if you're down in the, we've got a mountain ridge. If you're higher elevation, the day won't start for another hour or so.
I see the shadows are getting long.
But when does the day start? So, somebody called up a few years ago, 10, 12 years ago, a guy from New Zealand, and said, can you tell me in Scripture where a day begins? It's like, well, just ask any Jewish person or Seventh-day Adventist. They'll tell you it starts at sunset. Well, when sunset? There was one time we were approaching sunset on, I think it was Friday night, Friday evening. It's like, oh man, the sun's just about ready to hit the horizon. I go, wait a second, there's a shopping center on top of the hill. If I go up there, I've got another hour. Yeah, now we're just messing with legalities. I mean, remember, there's that story in, was it Exodus or Numbers, where they were told that the Israelites, the collection of the 12 tribes with Yahweh leading them. I mean, they had the pillar of fire and the covering canopy of smoke, and Moshe's around, and do not work on the Sabbath day, on the seventh day. And there's this one guy went out to pick up sticks. However many he picked up, I don't know. Did he have there was a cover of the Zoso album of Led Zeppelin. There was a guy carrying a whole bundle of sticks. And I don't know why that picture's on there. And somebody said, oh, that album was in regards of that man that was defying the Sabbath day. I don't know if that's true, but the concept is, there's a picture of a guy with a huge burden of twigs on his back to make a fire with. And a bunch of fellows grabbed him and says, you're not supposed to be doing this. Shut up, leave me alone. They took him to Moshe and said, what are we supposed to do with him? And Moshe's like, come on, you guys, cut it out. Don't we have better things to attend to? I don't know. So Moshe goes and he asks Yahweh, what do we do? And Yahweh said, stone him, kill that guy. Because of high-handed, stiff-necked disregard and aggression against the Torah instructions. So does that mean, oh, I dropped my pen. Oh, I can't pick it up. Is that what it means? Now, my whole life I never had a regard for what you're supposed to do or not supposed to do on the Sabbath day. Remember when we had a reference of Sunday being the seventh day, churchgoers, well, there was the thought that maybe you shouldn't work, maybe you shouldn't be employed. But then you get a job when you're 16 and they want you to work on Sunday, and it's like, well, is it a law or not? How serious is it? That guy got killed for picking up pieces of wood. What about flipping hamburgers? Making French fries? That's what I was doing back then. I don't know. As we said in the other video, a friend of ours went to a church where they were not allowed to have the water in a lake go above their knee on a really hot 115, 20 degree summer day. Well, you can go to the lake, but don't let that water go above your knee. That's a sin. You'd be... What's the phrase in Isaiah 58? Doing what your own pleasure?
About seeking your own pleasure.
Well, so because it says something in Isaiah 58 about those who seek their own pleasure on the Sabbath day, of course, then we did a video a couple years ago about considering that Isaiah 58 was about Yom Kippur.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Sabbath day, because Yom Kippur is what they call a Shabbat Shabbaton. There's Caleb. The point is, who's to say what you're supposed to do or allowed to do or not supposed or not allowed to do? And when does a day start for when that...
Let's talk about that.
when that legal imperative is imposed to where you can be put to death if you do the wrong thing. So the people that have a regard do things like they don't turn on light switches, they don't drive a car. I remember hearing a story about a rabbi that was going to a meeting and the sun hit the horizon on Friday. He stopped the car, he got out, and he walked the last, I guess it was a couple miles, and ended up having quite a following. Everybody thought, wow, this guy is really serious. Do you remember that movie with, was it Gene Wilder? Frisco Kid. Oh. And he was being chased by some bad guys, and all of a sudden, Friday night, sunset, got to get off the horse. So why we're being chased by outlaws? It's like, hey, can't write. I mean, these guys have a really serious regard. I'm not putting them down. No mocking. But the question is, where is the legal regard? There was a certain fellow who was going to get baptized, and it was a Friday night, and the question came up about, well, is Friday evening after sunset really the Sabbath day? And this other guy said, if you don't sanctify Friday night as the Shabbat, you should be stoned to death, completely alienated from any fellowship with believers, with Israel. Really, is that the case? If the day starts Friday night, as soon as that sun hits the horizon, of course this isn't Friday night, but as soon as that sun hits the horizon on Friday night, that's it. You pick up a tool, you're in big trouble. Well, where do they get that? I was talking with Andrew Gabriel Roth, have a lot of respect for him, and asking, he's the guy who did the Aramaic English New Testament, fine book to read. It's say, where do you get, or culturally, where do the Jews get, and then Seventh-day Adventists, I believe, copy the Jews, but where do they get the idea that a day starts at sunset? Genesis 1. The first 5 verses is day 1, and then the same typical pattern is repeated for 6 verses. This fellow from New Zealand called up and said, can you prove it? So back when I was first studying this, I thought, I better look at it. I don't know where anybody else gets the idea, but let me see if I can look at it, and what do I see? So here, this is Stone's Tanakh. In the beginning, I'll read the English, in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. Well, so what it really says is, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim va'et haaretz. Ve'haaretz hayata tohu ve'bohu. Ve'hosek al penei techom. Ve'ruach Elohim merechefet al penei ha'mayim. Vayomer Elohim yehi or. Yehi or. Vayira Elohim et ha'or ki tov. Va'ivdal Elohim bin ha'or ubin ha'chosek. Vayikra Elohim la'or yom. Va-la-chosek kara laila. Vayehi erev vayehi boker yom echad. So notice, when he said, let there be light, he says, yehi or, va, that's and, yehi or. So in English, it's let there be light, and there was light. So the phrase is translated, let there be, and then the exact same word is translated, and there was. But they're actually the same word in Hebrew. Yehi or and Yehi or. And there again at the end it says Yehi erev and Yehi boker. It's the exact same phrasing. So the same statement when he said, let there be light, and it's more like exist light and exist light. It's the exact same phrase. It's not translated that way in English. But then it says in English here, I'll just read what it says in this translation. When the earth was astonishingly empty, with darkness upon the surface of the deep, and the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated between the light and the darkness. God called to the light day, and he called to the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. Well, see, they've translated different. Let there be, and there was. So they translate it and there was evening, and there was. But why not say, let there be evening, let there be morning, one day? And why use the word God? I mean, God is a bad English use of words as far as I'm concerned, so I'll use the Hebrew word Elohim. Aleph Lamed Hey Yod Mem. The point is, the same creative statement, Yehi Or, and there's light. There's Or, Aleph Vav Resh. The same thing he said, Yehi Erev. Well, the word Erev is translated evening, but it's blending. The sun's just about to hit the horizon, so the darkness and the light are starting to blend. If you have
Mixing and mingling.
mix and mingle, it's also a swarm of bees or a swarm of insects where you can't tell one from the next. If you take an airbrush and you go from a dark saturation of a color, blending it to another saturation of another color, like black to white or red and green or any colors, fully saturated, airbrushed to another full saturation, you can't distinguish, you can't tell where it actually changes. That's the meaning of Erev. It can't be distinguished or determined. The word boker, bet kuf resh, is also the word to plow the field. If you take a plowshare and you dig it into the earth and you pull a line with it, two sides erupt, two mounds on either side of that blade, and it causes a valley, a rift. It makes a distinction. So when he says Vayahi Erev, Vayahi Boker, he's saying let there be the blending or exist a blending and exist a separating, a breaking apart, Yom Echad. And the word Yom is day and the word Echad is one or unified. So we go back and we say, well, first of all, when he said the divine presence hovered, that's the Ruach of Elohim. They translated here divine presence, but it's otherwise translated the spirit of Elohim. But that word Ruach is also mind, will, intention, disposition, frame of boy,
Go ahead.
Getting jittery? Do you need some more coffee there or something?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm just adjusting.
Okay,
Just carry on. Don't worry
anyway,
about me.
When it says Yirah Elohim, that he saw or he perceived, Elohim did. See, in Hebrew, the verb is first and then the noun that is doing the verb. We might say in English the opposite, Elohim saw. But here it says Yirah Elohim, just so you know how Hebrew works. Et ha'or ki tov, that the day was, or that the light was good. Va'ivdal. Now here's this word, Vav Yod, those are two prefix letters, then Bet Dalet Lamed, Badal, or Vedal. That's separated. And in the dictionary here, page 64, in the middle, Klein's dictionary, to depart, be detached, to remove, separate, stay away from. So Yahweh was going to somehow separate the light from the dark. So if you have one hand and say this is light, and the other hand and this is dark, what do you do to separate the two from each other? He created two different mechanisms. One is a blending, an erev, like in carpentry you'd call this a finger joint. You make this kind of a joint where you've got more gluing surfaces, and then you have this other which is like a butt joint, which is very little glue on the surface. So the finger joint is a lot stronger. This is like this blending, where this fading together. So he made a fading together like an airbrush, which is indistinguishable, to be able to tell where one stops and the other one starts. And then there's this other butt or breaking apart where it's opposite. This is clearly distinguished from that, but this is light and this is dark. So for him to say he separated, detached, made a difference, a partition, that's all Ivdal. Another way that you could look at that is that you've got Yod, Bet, Dalet, Lamed. So if I'm going to write in Paleo letters, Yod, Bet, Dalet, Lamed. There's a Vav, and that's typically simply translated and. It could be other things. Well, here's a hand. There's a grabbing hand. you can see this grab, that's the bet is basically on or with, if it's used as a prefix. Dalet is a literally door, and lamed is an authority. That's a shepherd's staff. So I could say the word Ivdal is literally hand, on, door, authority. Well, that's kind of a picture of a door handle. So there's this door handle. There's this authority on the door handle, or this thing which opens or closes. Or so look at a door. One side has hinges where the door is blended, and then a pin is put down into the hinge, blended to the wall. And the other side is this strike bolt that opens and separates. Where do you open and close the door on the wall? On the side with the separation, not the blending. You look at a belt. You know, one side is hooked and the other side opens. Where do you open and close the belt? Where do you open and close the door? Where do you open and close the day? Where it's blended or where it breaks open to divide. Yahuwah himself divided and made two mechanisms by which light is attached to dark. One is a blending, and it could stretch out for quite some time. Now they say, people who study this matter says, there's a phrase, bin ha'erevin, between the evenings. You're supposed to slaughter the Passover sacrifice between the evenings. Between the evenings, what does that even mean? Oh, that's in the afternoon. Why do they say that? Well, if you take the zenith of the sun, 12 o'clock noon, and then it starts to descend. Okay, that's one evening, that's one blending. Well, that's where it starts. And then when it hits the horizon, they say, well, that's the other one. But sometimes they say, well, if it hits the horizon, that's the beginning of the evening, because the nighttime is starting to close in. And then they say, well, if you see 3 stars, as soon as you see 3 stars, you know it's really dark. 1 star might be an airplane or a planet, but when you see 3 stars, okay, let's call that night. So you got to stop everything by that time. Well, if you're going to get stoned to death for picking up a tool, is that appropriate? Well, if the day starts in the evening, you better not pick up a tool. But what if the day starts in the morning, at the boker, when things separate? Could that be? Now, you were saying that you saw a certain verse in, what was it, Matthew?
Well, I got a lot of notes here.
What do you have to throw into the conversation?
Well, there's more than just Matthew.
Say a couple.
Well, I'll just come out there.
Why don't you pull up a chair here in the blending, the evening. The reason why they call it evening in English, just so you know, it's the evening out of the day and the night, the blending together. I never knew that, just called evening.
You were in Genesis 1, but he distinguishes right there. Yahuwah called the light day and darkness he called night. Light is called day, darkness is called night. Very simple. And then he goes on to say, let the lights come into being in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. But what really is striking is if you go into like the manna episode, in Exodus 16:22, this is very clear. And it came to be on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moshe. And he said to them, this is what Yahuwah has said. Tomorrow is a rest, a Sabbath set apart to Yahuwah. That which you bake, bake, and that which you cook, cook. Lay up for yourselves all that's left over, and keep it until morning, boker. And they laid it up until boker, and Moshe commanded it did not stink, and no worm was in it. And Moshe said, eat it today, for today is the Sabbath. Today you will not find it in the field. Gather it 6 days, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there is none. You can recap that. Lay it up for yourselves, all that is left over, to keep it until morning. And they laid it up till morning, and Moshe commanded, and it did not stink, and no worm was in it. And Moshe said, eat it today, for today is the Sabbath. And there's...
well, how do you know that Sabbath didn't start Friday night?
Because he was telling them to gather this stuff today, the 6th day.
Well, let's just suggest, just for the sake of conversation here, that I know the whole other conversation about the lunar Sabbath, the sliver of the moon, and how do you calculate when a week starts, and a day starts and that whole thing. I'm not trying to be contentious or to blow that off, but what I'm saying, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to use the names of the days of the week to try to keep things straight. A fellow by the name of Tim Asselford up in Calgary, Canada, did a whole study, and he was calling them, the daylight hours, and people's minds are, it's difficult enough to keep the subject straight, and so you have to call the daylight hours, the night hours, the evening, the morning. You have to be willing to take this as a very serious subject, and I'm not suggesting that anybody who regards the lunar Sabbath is wrong, because it's worthy of a conversation, it's worthy of a discussion, it's worthy of a regard, and I know that some very serious people have a belief that the lunar Sabbath is worth paying attention to and taking that as the calendar. And we could have that conversation. But this is talking about when a day starts, and so we're going to isolate it down and refer to Friday, Saturday, and I know some people don't like those names of the days of the week, but for the sake of addressing this, we will. Let me just say one thing about this, about talking about morning and evening. And you go back to Genesis 1. Let me jump back to there real quick. It says that first there was dark, Hosek, and then he said, let there be light. Now the word blending, Arev, you have to have two things to blend, like two colors. Two things, this and this, get to be blended. Two things in order to break them apart and separate them. You can't have Ivdal unless you have two things. So for anybody to say, the day started in the evening, is impossible. The day started, day one, he said there was a status quo of darkness, and he never tells us when the Mayim, the waters or the deep, he didn't even talk about that. He just says, okay, we're going to start with the darkness, and there's this depth of waters, and the Ruach of Elohim is fluttering or hovering, the divine presence. That's another subject we talked about another time. The wiggling string of string theory being the alphabet. But then he said, let there be light. So the first thing we have on record of him creating is light. Now you've got these two things, and they're not blended or they're not separated. They're just the status of two different things. And then he said, be blended and be separated, broken apart. You cannot start the day in the evening, because an evening means you have to have two things already. He started with two separate things. It cannot start in the evening. When I was talking to Andrew Gabriel Roth, he said, well, the way that Elohim's mind works, the way he expresses himself, he starts at the top and he wraps around to here. So he starts at the dark, and then there was light, and then he starts back at the beginning again. There's evening, then there's morning. But wait a minute. When this fellow from New Zealand had contacted, what does it say? He said, he worked, and then he said there came to be evening and there came to be morning. Well, it doesn't say came to be. He says exist evening, exist morning, and then he called it a day. And then he worked. There was evening, there was morning, and then he called it a day. And then he worked. There was evening, and there was morning, and then he called it a day. For 6 days in a row, first he worked. Once morning was the last thing that happened, he worked. There was evening, and then there was morning, and then he called it a day. At morning, he didn't call it a day when the sun hit the horizon. For 6 days in a row, Yahuwah in Genesis 1 called it a day after he said there was Boker. So anybody who says, you look at Genesis 1 and a day starts in the evening, that's a way of reading, it's a way of interpreting, but it's not what it says in my eyes. And then there's a fellow by the name of Rabbi Lauterbach, Lauterbach. You can find it on the internet. And he says, in ancient times, the Jews, at least some, if not all, they regarded that a day started at the morning, at the Boker. But in order to protect the Sabbath day that Nehemiah did, he said, all right, you guys keep profaning the Sabbath, and the foreigners kept bringing in food to sell. So he said, I'm shutting the gates of Jerusalem when the shadows hit the walls on Friday afternoon, and I'm not opening them up until Sunday when the sun is warm. Well, wait a minute. That's not saying you should be stoned to death, like that fellow told me, Friday evening. That means shut it down and start preparing and getting ready. But what we've inherited is you better start preparing Friday afternoon. I had a concrete pour. I had hired a Seventh-day Adventist guy to help me. It was Friday afternoon, and we have a truckload of concrete. Oh, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm out here. It's like, what? Him and his crew. It's like, oh, come on, man. Oh, he's got to be sitting down and cleaned up and everything tidy when the sun hits the horizon. I don't think that's what it means. Well, he thought that's what it meant, and that's what he's living his life. Bully for him. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that if you are finishing your stuff and it's the sun hit the horizon, that you could be stoned to death. Now, Saturday, don't work. Regard what Yahuwah said. But Friday night, Sunday morning?
There's more verses here, too.
Here, let's hear them.
Well, Messiah even added to the testimony. He said, are there not 12 hours in a day? He said that in John 11:9.
Well, what do you mean, are there not 12 hours in the day?
12 hours in a day.
Isn't there 24 hours in a day?
Not according to Messiah.
Now,
there's a funny verse in Job 17:12. He said they would turn night into day, saying the light is near in the presence of darkness. It's probably not. I just got a kick out of it when I read that.
Well, let me say something. I was quoting from the scripture, and I think it was in Daniel 9, and it said something about 1,290 days or years. And one translation says days, and the other one years. And I said one or the other, and somebody accused me of pushing my own agenda. And the word is yom. Sometimes the word yom is translated year or era or an epoch.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's translated day. Sometimes the word yom means 12 hours, if that's what Yeshua said, and sometimes we regard it as 24. Sometimes they regard the watch of the night, going back to the Roman times. And it's like, there's certain things we say, well, that's what it says in English. It's like, you have to take everything with, call it a grain of salt, depending on the translation and depending on who is telling you what it says. So go back and look at it in Hebrew. Does yom mean 12 hours, 24 hours, or a day for a year, or a day means 1,000 years? Call it a yom. To study the Paleo, you could say, well, Yod, Vav, Mem. Yod is this working hand, Vav is this connecting device, a nail or a bridge of some kind. Mem is water, a hand connected to water. What is that a day? Well, if water is, where we get the word, a laver, a pool of water, a laboratory, so your hand in the laboratory where you're making stuff is yom, which you might be able to do in the darkness, but it's not likely, especially out here. Boy, it's black, dark. But Lila, Lamed is this, like a letter, in English, the letter J. It's a shepherd's staff. It has to do with turning. Lamed is Hallel, hallelujah. It's something spinning and turning like a spiral staircase. So the time to stop and reflect and look and think, that's Lila. I was just contemplating, why would he call Chosek Lila? Why would he call Yom, the or Yom? There's something about the way you spell the words. So nighttime is for what? Spinning, dancing, thinking, talking, and just looking at stuff. And Yom is the day that you put your hand to the laboratory and make things happen. Go ahead.
I've also had this brought up before when trying to share this with people. They'll bring up Leviticus 23:32, where it talks about, it's the Sabbath of rest to you, and you shall afflict your beings. On the 9th day at the month at evening, from evening to evening, you observe your Sabbath. But if you think about that, why would he need to put those special instructions in there for this high Shabbat if all days didn't start, if all Sabbaths didn't start at a Rev?
Well, see, that's Yom Kippur, and people I've also heard said, well, because he specified in Leviticus 23 for the Shabbat Shabbaton, the high Sabbath of Yom Kippur, 7th month, 10th day, but it's supposed to start the evening of the 9th. Well, if a day started at the evening, then the evening of the 9th is like before the 9th. But here he says, well, the evening of the 9th is at the end of the Yom, daylight period of the 9th. Start at the evening of the 9th, then you have nighttime, and then you have the daytime of the 10th, and then going on into the evening time of the 10th. And so that's when it's supposed to be. But he didn't say start it at the evening of the 10th to the evening of the 11th. He said start at the evening of the 9th.
Now, there's special instructions for that.
So that's an anomaly. But I've heard people say, well, that's the typical. That sets it up for every single day.
No.
I don't agree. So now here, what I'm saying is that by having this conversation, I'm not trying to say that everybody else is wrong and I'm right. I'm just saying I disagree. And I was at a conference once, and the same guy that said I should be stoned to death for not sanctifying Friday night, we went out to a restaurant, had a bite to eat. It was Saturday night after the conference was over, and I'm sitting there talking to him, and all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, if I'm right about when a day starts, this guy's committing a mortal sin and should be stoned himself. So they are really protective of saying, boy, as soon as that sun hits the horizon on Saturday, woohoo, let's go to the store, let's go back to work. It's like, wait a minute. This brings up another question. If the Sabbath day starts in the Boker in the morning, should you be stoned to death if you work Saturday night? Now, you brought up about the manna. There's one other really interesting place. This is just to cause more trouble in trying to think about what this day starts. Then we'll go on to a couple other things we're reading there. The first time that the quail showed up, there's 2 times. The people were complaining that they were hungry, they wanted meat, they didn't have any manna yet, but Yahweh was speaking to Moshe, and he says, tomorrow you're going to have manna, and you're supposed to pick it up for 6 days, and on the 6th day pick up twice, because on the 7th day there was going to be none. Tomorrow you're going to have manna. Now, what day of the week was he talking to Moshe? And I sat there with 3 or 4 guys, and we were looking at this, and it doesn't tell you. It's kind of a riddle. It might have been, let's say the 3rd or the 4th day of the week. And he says, now you know which is the 6th day of the week. So you're going to pick up manna for 6 days and then pick up double on the 6th day and none on the 7th. And if it was the 3rd or 4th day of the week, he said, now, okay, but just for a couple days, and then you're going to pick up twice on Friday and none on Saturday. He said that this is to test the people, whether they're listening to him. It's like, he wouldn't pull some funny business like that. He would say, tomorrow's day 1, and you're going to pick it up for 6 days, double on the 6th and none on the 7th. So that means the day he was speaking to the Israelites had to have been Shabbat. So if it was Shabbat and tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, or the first day of the week morning, would be when the manna starts, and they pick it up for 6 days and don't even go out to look for it on the 7th day morning, then that means he was talking to Moshe, let's call it Saturday night. But he said, tonight I'm going to send in this quail, and you guys can eat meat. Tonight. Well, that would have been Saturday night. Now, if he says, don't pick up anything, certainly don't pick up any wood, or you're going to stone to death, does that mean he says, well, it's okay to go shopping or collecting food? I mean, those quail, from what I understand, they were tired. They just flown all the way, migrating from Africa, and they're sitting there. But you got to grab it, wring its neck, or whatever you're going to do, and then you bite into it, and eat it, or you got to pluck it and feather it.
Might want to cook it.
But that was Saturday night. So what that means, even if Shabbat started in the morning, the Boker, something about Saturday night is still legal to do your food and prepare things. So what I'm saying, just to make it clear, what I'm saying is that in my recognition, and my wife doesn't agree necessarily, or nobody else has to agree necessarily, but from what I can see, the only time legally to say don't work because there's a threat of death is from Boker to sometime in the Erev on Shabbat. And if you work Saturday night or go out to eat Saturday night, that's on you.
Maybe that's when the 3 stars come into play.
Well, maybe, but what I'm saying is that, I don't see a legal imperative because of that one case that Yahweh himself provided the quail to eat Saturday night and said, go have at it. And it's like, okay. So I'm not saying that it's supposed to be a 24-hour regard. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, it's just one more verse. I was kicking around the Brit Hadashah and looking at the words in the Greek. And in Matthew 28:1, it said, that's the one, in the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week. If you look at the couple Greek words there, in the end, that the word is opse in the Greek, and it means after the close of the day.
How can the close of the day be at the dawning?
And then at the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn, and that word there is epiphosi, or epiphosco.
Where you get the
And
word
that-
phosphorus.
Yeah, phosphorus light.
The light breaking
and that's
open.
what it means, is to begin to grow light, to begin to dawn. So it's even the red hot Shah, the clarity of it.
So, again, the word shachar, as in shachar law, is at the dawning, and it means to go seek. And so when the people get up early and go seek and be excited about something, like when we were kids and looking at the Christmas tree, Christmas morning, or the Talmudim, the disciples, when Yeshua rose from the dead and they got up real early, before the boker, as boker, when the sun comes over the horizon, boof, the light, that's boker. But when does the day start? Is it at the Shakar Allah? So it's a blending in the morning. So when he says kill it between the evenings, is that between the what we would call the twilight or the nighttime evening and the morning evening and the Shakar Allah is this blending? What I'm saying is we've inherited traditions, misunderstandings, personal opinions, and we're trying to sort out what does Yahuwah, our Elohim, want us to do.
Well, when you start really scrutinizing the traditions and look at where they get this stuff from, you get more light.
Well, like I say, look up Rabbi Lauterbach, and this one fellow that said that he had access to this incredible library in Jerusalem, and he said no Jew has ever regarded the daylight, the morning being the beginning of the day, ever. And then somebody called up and said, hey, wait a minute, the Jewish Encyclopedia of, I think it was 1906, says right there that they used to regard the boker, the morning, as the beginning of a day. So I don't know where this guy had his information, but it apparently...
Probably from the Word.
If you're gonna kill somebody, if you're gonna be the judge to declare that somebody ought to be stoned to death, you better have your facts straight. And apparently, there's more tradition than fact. And the Yom HaShabbat, the day of the Sabbath, is a serious regard. But the evening before and the evening after, do as you please.
If there was any doubt in my mind, I'd be regarding it as sundown. But once I started studying this out, it erased all doubt or all uncertainty.
There's something wonderful. I've visited a few people who Friday evening they have this what they call a Rev Shabbat, and they have which is the evening of Shabbat, and they have a get together with people and they have a wonderful meal, and it's the high point of the week. It's great.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm not knocking
and
those people.
there's times when I've had to work Friday night, and it's like, gosh, what a ripoff. It's better to have the Erev Shabbat on Friday night, but not to say that somebody is worthy of death. Go ahead and regard it. Go ahead and sanctify it. And I know people that say, look, whether it's in the valley, whether it's on the mountaintop, whether it's in the spring or the fall. I have a great friend up in Canada, and he says, look, we just call it 6 o'clock. 6 p.m., that's it. We started Rev Shabbat, 6 p.m. Summer or winter, doesn't matter. 6 p.m. it's over the next day. It's like, fine, whatever. I'm not going to kill anybody. I'm not going to suggest that they're breaking the Shabbat. If the 6 p.m. is like, where's the legal technicality? Do you think that Yahweh cares about that technicality? Maybe he does. I don't know. I'm asking the question. Do you think he cares about that? Make up your own mind. Walk before him with a sincere heart.
Indeed.
Didn't it say, walk out your own salvation in fear and
Fear
trembling?
and trembling.
Well, do that. And I'm not trying to provoke anybody to walk waywardly, to sin,
No, not
to
at all.
err.
Just dig in and see what you find.
Well, I'm trying to relieve people's feelings of guilt for something that might just be tradition. And I've heard people say, them Jews, by golly, they've been doing this for 1,000 years. They know darn well when the day starts. Because for 40 years in the wilderness, they were keeping it because they had the pillar of fire, pillar of smoke, and Yahweh was leading them. And that's just kind of been burned into their consciousness for all these years later. And it's like, yeah, well, look at Jeremiah. And Yahweh said, you guys, talking about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, you guys have been detestable wickedness. You've blended everything with all kinds of pagan customs, and I'm casting you out, and go do whatever you want. Yahweh threw everybody out. So to say that any of the 12 tribes have kept anything sacredly since the days of Moshe and wandering the wilderness just ain't so. everything has gotten so convoluted and distorted.
Oh, that's the dinner bell.
That was
We got-
the turkey.
Huh? No, that wasn't the turkey. That was Tim honking the horn. Dinner's ready,
All
man.
right, well,
we got barbecue.
have we
This will get
discussed the
people
matter?
talking. That's all we want to do. Get them digging into the Word.
I think it's great to appreciate a Rev Shabbat. I've been at people's house, and when I go to their house and they have the lunar Sabbath, I'm on their calendar in their house. I'm not going to profane
No,
their
of course
regard.
not. We're not knocking anybody. I love the brothers. Whoever did their Rev Shabbat for who knows how long, and just start digging in.
At least we're looking at what he said. And that means that even though that people in the whole Christendom, the whole world of Christendom, that regards Sunday, I remember thinking that Sunday was the Sabbath day. I remember when Black Sabbath came out with an album called Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, how dare they and there was a certain guy that was George, I forget, it starts with a W, can't remember his name, a famous Scottish writer, and he wrote this book about how these guys were playing cards on Sunday, and it was this crime, and some demons came in, and it's like, that's not even the Sabbath day. No demons are going to come in because you're playing cards on Sunday. Gosh. But people had a sacred regard even of that Sunday. And this isn't about who to throw the rocks at. This is about what did Yahuwah, our Elohim, tell us to do by keeping the covenant. And as we read in Isaiah 55, 56, he says keep it. You look at Exodus 20, where he gave the 10 Commandments, and right after that he says, you got to keep this Sabbath day, because remember, the way you keep it is whether you're in covenant. It's a sign that we are his people, and it opens everything up, and I believe it was changed and distorted and thrown this way and that, so that it's impossible to tell what it really is, in order to rob us of that secret weapon, you might say. So this is very serious, very critical, and this video is liable to disturb a lot of people. Don't mean to disturb, but just trying to provoke people to
Just dig
study.
in, look at it, yeah. Okay, people have been asking the 2,730-year curse.
We're going to do that
That'll
the
be
next
the next
video.
one. Okay.
We'll do that the next video.
Just letting
Maybe
people
this
know real
evening.
quick.
What's it get started? Shalom.
Shalom.